So I'm once again joined with Secretary of State for Education, Bridget Phillipson. This is third, fourth time we've had a little chat about things, which is great. And obviously, white paper got announced the other week. I asked my social media following to submit any questions, and so I'm going to try my best to get through as many as we can in the time we're given. So the white paper promises transformational change for children with SEND, and there's so much in there. I wanted to start with a question where if a teacher listening to this who is working in a classroom, 30 or more children, a fair few of them with particular needs, not as much support staff as we'd like, if they're still teaching in 5 years, what does that classroom look like compared to the one teacher working in today?
Yeah, thanks so much. So we did set out the white paper and the SEND consultation that runs alongside that. And I would really encourage people to go and take a look, but also to share their views, because it is a consultation. Yeah. So we do want to hear from people, whether you're a teacher, someone working supporting families and children, or a parent. So would really encourage people to do that. The vision for the white paper is that we want a school system that supports every child to achieve and thrive. We've got a system that's working well in many areas, but where we know the outcomes for some children are not where they should be. Now, that's especially true for children with SEND. And what that teacher will see over time is more investment going into their school directly. So we're investing more every year of this Parliament into schools and SEND. But alongside that, over the course of the next 3 years, more money going into schools through our Inclusive Mainstream Fund, so that will allow schools to better support children with a range of needs, not always waiting for that EHCP or having to fill out lots of forms, but getting money directly to deliver small group interventions, and then through the Experts at Hand initiative, both of those together is an extra £4 billion into schools, to be able to bring in speech and language support, ed-psych support, and a real focus on how we can better support staff. Now, what teachers will also see, and support staff too, is more money and investment to go into training. I've heard from staff, from teachers too, that they don't feel that they've always had the support that they've needed around responding to children with a wider range of needs. Initial teacher training has improved in lots of ways, and there's more content on SEND from this year. But obviously that doesn't help those that have been in the profession a while and want more specialist support alongside that. So we are taking our time to build up to the bigger changes that will come, in 2030, but we're investing up front to deliver that change. And I know that change is necessary, and I've heard from staff that they want the system to work better, but I also know it's unsettling, because, change, that's just the nature of change. But it is right. This is all focused on children, but we know we can't deliver that unless we put in place the right investment, the right support, but also take parents with us too. And I also have to be really mindful of how we kind of engage with parents through this process.
Absolutely, because I think the ambition, I think we can agree the current system isn't working, and the ambition of the white paper is something that a lot of people agree with and sort of admire. But looking through some of the comments, the word I would sort of describe a lot of people's feeling is sort of apprehension. And I think that's come from, previous governments and previous people in power just promising one thing and not actually delivering. And we're in a situation now where it feels for a lot of teachers, a lot of parents, that it's at breaking point. So what can you say to that level of apprehension? Sort of what can you ensure that this government is going to do that's different to previous ones?
I'm going to completely recognise that, and I think it's for the reasons that you've just given, which is, over time we've asked more and more of teachers and staff, and they haven't always felt as well supported as they should have been, and I completely understand that. I mean, not just through the white paper, but through everything we're doing to support families, to make bigger changes that will help staff in schools. It's all with that end in mind. So, the work we're doing around child poverty, the expansion of Best Start family hubs, early family support services, the expansion of early years education, the intention is that we catch needs sooner, that we support families sooner, and that when children arrive at school, staff are having to deal less with, children who are not able to use the toilet independently, struggle with independent skills, whether having to find temporary accommodation for families, excessive pressures around safeguarding. If we can take some of that pressure off, then we better allow teachers and staff to support, focus on what they came into the profession to do in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, that was going to be my next question about, I think one of the biggest positives for me was looking at that talk of early support, which I think has been lacking for a number of years, and it's just added to sort of teachers' workload. The one thing, because you've sort of answered that with all the what you've talked there about the early years fund and the hubs, and fingers crossed they can have a sort of similar impact to what we've seen previously with the likes of Short Start. The one thing that really stood out to me with the white paper is there wasn't really much mention of support staff. And I feel like these are the people in school that tend to work most with children with SEND, doing those interventions, planning, differentiating those lessons. And I feel it's almost impossible to achieve the level of inclusion the white paper wants without having those people. But we're seeing so many of them leave because of pay, because of lack of value. So what would you say to support staff working in schools about what you're going to do to ensure that they are thriving as well as what you want to achieve with the children?
I mean, our schools only succeed because of the amazing work of our support staff. And obviously that includes staff who are, supporting children with SEND in the classroom, our teaching assistants, learning support assistants, but also the whole school workforce, the people that keep the lights on, that, serve the dinners at lunchtime. They do a fantastic job, and they haven't always been valued or recognised for that work. We've legislated through the Employment Rights Act to bring back the school support staff negotiating body. That used to exist until 2010, and the last government took it away. It hadn't long been in operation when that happened, but the focus of that was to improve terms and conditions for staff, to make sure that wherever you are in the country, you can have greater confidence about what job roles look like, what the support you can expect looks like, what the kind of training and professional development looks like, alongside those questions of pay. This was a big manifesto commitment for us. Our kind of affiliated trade unions, like the GMB and Unison, they really want this to work, and they really want to give voice to support staff. So for the very first time, our support staff will be back at the table. Will be able to make their voices heard, and we'll, be bringing that forward very soon, and that will start to take effect from 2027.
And do you see, or do you envisage the funding looking at bringing more support staff into schools?
So schools will have more funding directly to respond to need. So, you'll recall that in 2014 there was a big reform of SEND. I mean, the intention behind it, I think, was the right intention, but it just hasn't worked. Before we were in that world, we did used to fund schools more directly to do some of this, because children's needs aren't static. Some children with the right level of support can make the progress and then, can carry on their journey. Other children will need more specialist support, and that's what we've set out in the SEND consultation around specialist provision packages. But I think we need to go back to where we were before those reforms in 2014, where schools were funded to plan and manage this more effectively themselves, but including through, I've seen some great examples, including in inclusion bases, where teaching assistants, support staff are working together with the teacher to really make sure that education is of the highest quality and that children are supported. But that works best when you've got a teacher who's often directing some of that, when you've got the whole team supporting the child. And yes, the investment that we're putting in will allow schools to, to not just bring in specialist external support like speech and language, but also to plan and manage across a classroom how they can support children.
There was quite a few comments talking about how a lot of teachers working in mainstream basically bluntly saying that inclusion can't work in mainstream at the minute, not because they don't believe in it, but because of sort of capacity. So how do you see that changing, and why do you feel mainstream is the best place rather than looking at expanding more specialist provisions?
So we are investing more in creating specialist places. Many of those will be specialist places within mainstream. So those inclusion bases that allow for children to spend some of their time with their friends in mainstream classes, or, for example, taking part in lunchtime activity or assemblies, depending on the needs of the child and what's right for them. But then also having that specialist support too. And we are creating more specialist places standalone where they're needed. And, the specialist sector's got a really important role to play in supporting mainstream colleagues and in spreading that expertise. But I do think mainstream inclusion is the right way forward. I've heard from, lots of my colleagues in Parliament, have experienced this themselves. One colleague, Marie Tidball, who, was able to benefit from a brilliant mainstream education. But, someone like David Blunkett, one of my predecessors as the Secretary of State, because of his visual impairment, it was determined at that point, many, many years ago, that he should be sent away from his family into a boarding school far from home, which is unthinkable nowadays. But I do recognise that when schools are supporting children with quite a big range of need, they need not just the investment but also the support to do that really effectively. But actually outcomes for children with SEND in mainstream are stronger than in specialist provision, both in academic terms, but also their ability to go on to live a fulfilling adult life. And that's what we want. I want children to thrive in education, but we're also trying to set up our children for the world to come as well. And many children with SEND will need extra help along the way, but with the right support, and I've seen some inclusion bases that do this incredibly well. Parents saying to me that they didn't think their child would ever be able to get a job or live independently, and that had been totally transformed by the support that they'd had in an inclusion base.
And those inclusion bases, have you set it out that it's going to be in every secondary or primary as well?
So it'll be in every secondary with a commensurate number in primary, but you wouldn't need, depending on the number of children within a local area, you wouldn't need it in every primary. But we expect local authorities to put in place a similar level of provision across their area, and that's backed up by £3.7 billion of capital investment to make that a reality.
Well, I mean, the 4 billion sounds a big number, but if you look at breaking that down to how much an individual school, if it was spread out equally, it doesn't actually equate to an awful lot. So how do you see that funding actually having an impact in classrooms? What guarantees can you sort of make with that 4 billion that will actually have an impact in every school?
So this is targeted funding, the Inclusive Mainstream Fund that will allow schools to better cater for children's needs, and then the Experts at Hand money, which will allow schools to work together with other local schools and to bring in, for example, a speech and language therapist. But at the minute it can work, it's often on through the HCP process, which will be retained for children who need them. But it will also allow a school, for example, to say, right, we have, say, 6 children in a reception class. They all have a similar level of speech and language need. If we could get a speech and language therapist into the school on a regular basis to work with those children, we know we can, for those children, probably overcome the difficulties they're currently experiencing. It's that ability to have the money and to plan, but that also does require us to really build up the workforce.
I was going to say, so have we got that number of specialists there now, or is it a case that that's going to be a recruitment drive?
Well, we're building that up, so we're investing more in training all of those professionals that support children. And the bigger change, of course, from this system into the next doesn't happen until 2030. So the investment's going in over the next 3 years ahead of that bigger change in 2030. And there is a balance. So I understand that people really want that change to be felt quickly, and I want that too. But then at the same time, that bigger change also has to be done in quite a careful and managed way, so that when we move from one system to the next, it's a smooth and seamless transition for the staff, but also for children.
I think one of the most common questions, and this is where the devil will be in the details, is what actually counts as a complex need under the new system, because obviously there's a lot of talk about EHCPs, and is that going to lead to those thresholds just sort of tightening? And I think a lot of parents who have been through the struggle of getting an EHCP are sort of worried that they'll lose that sort of legal sort of support that they've got. So how does that work? Like what should we take as being because I think it's so difficult, isn't it? Because even if you take a need like ADHD, how that can present and how a child can cope with that need in a class can be vastly different. So how do we ensure that we're making sure every child can thrive as the white paper desires? Absolutely.
So, diagnosis will remain an important part of the system, but as you say, it's about need, because even with the same condition, children can have differing support needs, can be affected in different ways. So where it comes to what complex needs means, we've set out alongside the white paper a document that provides a draft of what that will be. But I'll be appointing an independent panel with both health expertise and education expertise to design those specialist provision packages that will be for children with EHCPs, and that'll be underpinned, that'll have a statutory underpinning. So to give a guarantee that wherever you are in the country, you can be confident of the support that you're getting. I mean, it's a postcode lottery at the moment.
It is, it's erratic depending.
It does vary a lot. So I'd really encourage people to go and take a look at those. We've published a draft version of what that involves, but this is a process now that the panel that I will appoint in due course will take forward, so that people can be confident that it's independent of government, that it's rooted in the best education and health evidence, but also where they'll be updated on a regular basis, because I've heard a lot from colleagues working in the specialist sector that they've reported differing levels of need even within the most complex groups of children. and they don't feel that always the approach or the evidence has kept pace with what they're seeing in their schools. So that's the intention. And absolutely, you know, as we move from one system to another, we want to make sure that's as smooth and as seamless as possible for children. And alongside EHCPs, there'll be individual support plans. So every child with SEND will have an individual support plan. Schools will be legally required to provide them, and there'll be national standards underpinning that. But the change from this system to the next one won't begin until 29-30 for the academic year 2030. So that means children who are currently in year 2. So we're quite a long way off.
Yeah.
And at that point, children will be reviewed against the new system and the right support will be put in place. But between, you know, now and then, we've got the chance to invest, to build up what's needed. And, you know, I do have a role to play in reassuring parents that this is about good outcomes for children. This is not about cutting costs or cutting corners or like arbitrary targets. We're investing more up front, and we're investing every year in schools and SEND. This is not about how we can, you know, make reductions, quite the opposite, in fact.
And talking about those ISPs now, aren't they? There's going to be another acronym that teachers are going to need to learn. There was quite a lot of comments talking about how so many schools are sort of already doing it, and the sort of targeted plus and specialist is very reminiscent of the old days of school action plus and statement. So what's going to be different about these to what we previously had before?
I think that is an important point, though, that lots of schools are already trying to do a version of this, and I've seen it work well in some schools, but it varies across the country. So this will be a digital document that will be designed between parents and the child's school. We'll carry with the child, so as they transition between primary to secondary or secondary to post-16, because the information that's sometimes shared and gathered can differ in terms of how it's carried forward with the child, and that can lead to disruption to a child's education, lots of frustration if parents feel that, you know, why does the school not understand where my child's got to in primary?
So that will be. I think that disconnect between primary and secondary can be. I think that's something to work on, so that transition's a lot smoother, because I've seen it with some of the students that we've had who were doing really well in primary, but when they go to secondary, it just sort of changes so much. So having that seamless transition is definitely going to help.
Absolutely, and the white paper also has a big focus on Key Stage 3, because we know that's an area, that move from primary into secondary, we often see a drop-off in attendance, we see a drop-off in children feeling that they belong in school, and it can become a lost time if we're not careful. So a real focus particularly on reading in that important phase, because if children can't read well, can't read confidently, then the whole of the curriculum's closed down to them. So that's part of the reason we're intending to bring in a reading test in year 8 to make sure we've got a focus on strong literacy as children make that transition from primary to secondary.
And on that point of the curriculum, obviously we've got the new curriculum being written at the minute. How is that going to cater? Because I feel the current curriculum we're delivering doesn't sort of work for neurodivergent children in a lot of ways. So what changes are you looking at making to make that curriculum more accessible for children with SEND needs?
Yeah, so we had the curriculum and assessment review, and we responded to that as a government, and we're in the process now of redesigning the new national curriculum. I am really ambitious for children with SEND, and I think we do need to make sure we don't inadvertently set a ceiling on the ambition that for children with SEND, who with the right support can often achieve great things too. And we just need to be slightly careful, I think, sometimes in how we approach that. But I do recognise there can be additional barriers to learning. It's why, alongside the white paper, there's a consultation on performance measures, so how we look at the progress that schools are making. We've got Progress 8 that I think works well as a measure, but we're also consulting alongside that on how we can better celebrate and recognise schools that are making the greatest progress for children that arrived that bit further behind. So our children that, in the jargon, we would often call lower prior retainers. How do we better track their progress? But not just track it, actually celebrate the schools that are doing that really well. If you've got a child that's at a lower starting point, but they make brilliant progress, but not quite the full Progress 8, how do we... That
doesn't work again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And new qualifications as well. I just announced last week, post-16 around V levels. So having really strong technical and vocational routes alongside the more traditional academic routes as well.
Yeah, I feel, speaking from a primary school teacher, I feel the current curriculum was there was just too much in it to try and get through, and actually sometimes teachers just need that trust and that opportunity to just be a little bit more flexible and take a little bit more time. So it'd be nice if it was streamlined, that there was more flexibility about teaching stuff really well, but not feeling there's not enough time to cram everything in.
And that's what we're trying to do, and it'll be fully digital, which will make it easier for staff as well, so easy to see what children have learnt at different points and therefore better kind of phase their learning. But there's always often really well-intentioned calls for putting things on the curriculum, and sometimes what I have to guard against a bit is
not too much.
I understand the rationale sometimes behind what's being asked for, but you can't cover everything.
No.
And with the best will in the world, one lesson on a wet Wednesday afternoon in year 5 isn't necessarily going to stay with you for the rest of your life.
No.
And making sure that schools are covering the core content, and the national curriculum should be a floor. So it should be what we expect all children will be able to learn at school. But of course we want schools to kind of innovate and go beyond that, to have different approaches that might work well in their context, or
Absolutely.
be tailor it to local circumstance, or if you're studying a history topic, like making it
more purposeful.
Absolutely, and close to the local school community.
Yeah. Now the one thing that I think a lot of teachers are worried about is the impact this white paper is going to have on workload, especially Senkos. And I think a lot of teachers are looking at going, it sounds like it's going to be more work, more time, no reduction in what we're already expected to do. So, and I know there's rumours about the sort of 1,265 hours of directed time for teachers, and I think one of the unions is polling on that. So what can you say about how this isn't going to, because we know it's the reason most teachers are leaving, workload is the number one reason. So how do we ensure that with what the white paper is expecting from schools, that doesn't continue to add to that workload?
So on the 1265 point, through the process of the peer review body, where I write to them and ask them to make recommendations around pay, but also some of the wider workload pressures that staff are facing, I ask them to look at this to see how it's working. I've got no immediate plans to change that. But despite the fact it exists, I hear reports from staff that they're working beyond that.
Well, I think the vast majority are. But there is that level of protection, and I think a lot of teachers are worried at the minute that if that goes, it's going to be an absolute free-for-all. So we can have that as an exclusive that you're saying that's not going.
That's not going,
right,
but I do want to look at how we can better manage the workload that staff are experiencing. Now that is obviously a question about directed time, but I think it goes beyond that. And some of the biggest ways that we're trying to ease workload pressures are not just what we ask within school, but what we try and take away from teachers so that they don't have to do some of the jobs that have become routine within schools in the last 10 or so years, but really aren't the bread and butter of schools. I mean, I think it's brilliant when I visit schools and I can see that they're, running food banks, supporting families. I don't want schools to be running food banks.
No.
And I don't want schools to have to spend so much of their time on serious safeguarding. But we'll sort that out. We'll make that better by ending the 2-child limit, by expanding free school meals, by the investment that's going into early help and into the Best Start family services, so that families and children are supported before they arrive at school and around school. There's only so much we can ask of people working in education, and I know they'll always go above and beyond, but that does often come at a cost, and it can really, the kind of emotional toll it can take, and the burden and the responsibility that people carry. There are some things that only government can do, and we need to play our part in kind of easing that responsibility through the wider investment, whilst recognising that, yes, through the white paper, we are going to be asking schools to do things differently. But I think in a way that would reflect lots of what staff want to happen anyway. Like a better focus on how we can support children with a range of need, what we would call SEND need, but also just children that might be struggling at some point. That's what staff are doing day in, day out. But we as a government need to step in and make that easier.
Absolutely, and I think that's where hopefully the early support will come in, because when you hear of so many EYFS teachers who are spending a significant amount of the day changing nappies and doing those sort of basic things, I'm hoping the Best Start Family Hubs can hopefully ease that pressure, so teachers are doing what they do best, which is the education. I was
at one not too far away from you in Bury on Friday.
Oh right, okay.
And a brand new one that's just opened, and I visited one of the stay and play sessions, like rhyme time, and it was a building that was totally disused in quite a community that faces quite a lot of challenges. And the ability for parents just to get to their local centre, to get support from staff, but also there's an offer alongside that around SEND, and we're investing more into Best Start Family Hubs around SEND to make sure that we're identifying where families and children need that extra help long before they ever arrive in reception.
I mean that's I think what's been missing for a lot of parents is that trusted voice of somewhere to go to, because what a lot of parents end up turning to is online, and we know there's so much sort of misinformation there. So how many of those family hubs are open at the minute?
It's going to be 1,000. We're going to get to 1,000 about towards the end of the Parliament, and we're investing £1.5 billion. We're going to make an announcement on this soon as well around the next hubs that are due to open. But a huge investment in family services, and obviously the big expansion of early years education and childcare too.
Yeah, and just going back to the point on Senkos, that's one of the biggest worries, because their workload already is at sort of breaking point. So what can you do to sort of make sure they're staying and doing the job without burning out and sort of leaving?
So there's a part in the consultation that talks specifically about the role of Senkos, and I'd encourage Senkos to go and take a look and share their thoughts on how we can make that role not just more manageable but also more effective. You're talking about our most expert SEND professional within the school. And we're not supporting them to use that role kind of in the way that I think we really should be. The amount of time that people spend filling out forms, sending emails, chasing things up on admin tasks, when they should be the person, across the leadership team who is supporting individual classroom teachers and staff, is able to kind of plan and design the wider approach of a school and working with families. Because what I will also hear from parents when I visit schools is the thing that makes the biggest difference to them is to have that close relationship. They really trust the Senko, but they also want that kind of close relationship with the school overall, so that they can share what they're seeing at home, and the Senko or the class teacher can also share what they're seeing in the classroom. And that kind of partnership between families and schools is the thing that makes the biggest difference. We've done some work on this through our PINS programme, which is around neurodiversity, and hearing from the parents directly about some of the small changes that have come about where they've been able to spend time, with the Senko, with the wider team, makes a huge difference. But it also reduces, sometimes where you can end up in disagreement between schools and parents. We can, resolve some of that, make it more collaborative. Then I think we can ease some of the pressures too.
And the other sort of member of staff that I do worry about at the minute is obviously school leaders. And I think when you came in, I think the first interview we had, we talked about what we were going to do with Ofsted. And you said you were going to look at reforming them. Do you feel the reform, because I'll be honest with you, I think what they've ended, because they've been allowed to reform themselves, they've ended up creating something that, and I'm sure many teachers, school staff will agree, is potentially worse and having a negative impact on school leaders especially, which isn't going to help when we're so desperate to get, because I think head teacher should be one of the best jobs. Yet for so many it feels sort of untenable, and the pressure from Ofsted is not making that any easier. So what can you say to school leaders who feel that, similar to myself, that what Ofsted have created now isn't really learning the lessons of what happened with the Ruth Perry case and things like that? Because I do worry. Have you been through the new framework? Have you been through I've not personally, but I will get messaged. Numerous people will get in touch a week, and from what they're saying, it's not a positive experience. Some are, I'll be honest with you. I'd probably say 1 in every 20 might be positive, but a lot are sort of, especially for SLT at the minute with all the struggles they're facing in the wider school context, to have this added pressure now. I don't know, I just feel like there was a real opportunity to make it so much better than what they've created. I think there are lots of positives in the new framework, and inclusion is one area that for the first time is a big feature of what Ofsted are now looking at. And I've heard directly from schools that matters, that schools are really seeking to be schools rooted in their community, inclusive, they want to be recognised for the work that they're doing. And I've heard mixed views, but I have heard those who've been through the inspection, the new framework, which only kind of properly started really at the start of the year, and it is still quite early days. I've heard more positive experiences, but of course, that won't be universal. I know that Ofsted have tried to make some changes in terms of the day-to-day nature of the inspections and making sure that where there are issues that they respond to staff wellbeing problems during that inspection. It's obviously a very different system in terms of taking away those headline grades. It does look in a more granular way at
some areas that weren't looked at as closely, and inclusion being one. Also areas like attendance, behaviour. So it is a big change, and I want people to be able to use that inspection as a means of demonstrating what's working really well in their school, not just there being issues identified where there needs to be more done. What I would say, however, is that when you look previously at Ofsted inspections under the old framework, it could have been, some of those reports could have been written about any school. They didn't really capture what a school was doing, both for areas for improvement, but also things that are working well. I think if you read the reports now, you get a much stronger sense of that school. You would feel that you recognise the school on those pages in a way that before it was a bit generic.
Yeah, but from the data I've seen, there seems to be a trend that those schools working in a more disadvantaged area seem to be more penalised under the new framework. I'm
not sure that's right. I mean, I do think that you of course you need to take into account the context in which a school is operating. And we're doing quite a lot of work as a department in understanding some of those challenges that between schools. But what I would say is sometimes even a school within one kind of local authority area with pretty much the same demographic intake and the same level of disadvantage, the outcomes can vary significantly. So I am sympathetic to the challenges that schools face, particularly where we're seeking to overcome poverty and disadvantage and the barriers that children will face. But I do think we need to also encourage schools to work together and learn. If one school is able to achieve more for those children from that background, what is it they need to be doing to support other local schools in their area to make that? And that's about the collaboration that we need to encourage. Oh, absolutely. So a culture where schools will support one another.
I'd love to see much more of that. And it was just obviously I just saw the data about the new, it's not grades, is it, but the new sort of strands. And there was someone flagged that there was more schools in those disadvantaged areas, and I don't want it to lead to where we've been before. I just want a system that is much more supportive and collaborative. And I think that the struggle for a lot of schools is that there's still feeling of sort of inconsistency between inspectors. But like I say, it's early days, and hopefully they will take some feedback on board and move forward with it. So last couple of questions. Right, so let's, if we go from today, what are the next steps we're looking at? And obviously we're going through this consultation period now. So any teacher, parent listening to this who wants their voice heard, who maybe have seen something in the white paper that they want to sort of challenge or question, we want as many people to get involved and obviously help influence where we go from here. So what can people do?
Absolutely. So we're in a 12-week consultation period at the moment on the SEND reforms, and we're going to be holding regional events across the country for face-to-face events, as we did in the big conversation that we had on SEND ahead of publishing the white paper on the SEND reforms. I'd really encourage people to go and take a look at the white paper, take a look at the consultation. I know they're quite long documents. We have produced some shorter versions and easy read versions, and also lots of social media content to try and simplify some of it and to shorten it so that people can engage. But I would really encourage people, whether you're working in education or health, or you're a parent, go and take a look, share your thoughts. This is a once in a generation opportunity to really shape the school system and deliver better outcomes for children, and it won't come around again. So please.
So we just need as many people to get involved and share their thoughts and concerns, and hopefully this conversation's clarified a few things. And really appreciate your time again, Bridget. Thank you so much. And we'll have another catch up very soon, I'm sure.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.